Folks, and welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology on Demand. We are in lecture 7A, already done the first one. This is the second one in the series. And so now we are going to start examining the skin. And specifically, this lecture is going to be just on the epidermis, or the external portion of the skin. So first, I want you to realize when it comes to skin, there are only two layers. A lot of people like to make it 3 layers, but there's only 2 layers of skin. Each of these is going to have sublayers, but 2 layers of the skin. So we're going to start first with the thickest layer, which is the dermis. That we're not going to talk about in this lecture, but we're going to do that in the next one. Now, from the dermis, we're going to add the prefix epi, which means on. So the epidermis is on the dermis. In other words, it's external or it's superficial to the dermis. That's what we're going to be talking about in this recording. So those are the 2 layers, the dermis and the epidermis. Now, there is something deep to the dermis known as the hypodermis, because that prefix hypo means underneath. And the hypodermis is also known as the subcutaneous layer. Sub means below, cutaneous means skin. So subcutaneous means this is below the skin, which reinforces the concept that the dermis has 2 layers. Sorry, that the skin has 2 layers, the dermis and the epidermis. Okay. So now that I said it about 7 times, hopefully you have got it. So let's talk about the epidermis. Okay. And so here on the left, I have a photomicrograph looking at the epidermis, and on the right, I have a cartoon drawing showing the same type of thing. And basically, the epidermis is the epithelial layers of your skin. Okay, so it's epithelium on the outside, so it's epidermis. And in the epidermis, we have 4 different cell types. And depending where we are in your body, we'll either have 4 or we will have 5 layers in the epidermis. But whether you have 4 or 5 layers, the epidermis, just like all epithelium, is avascular. There are no blood vessels in it. So it has, all these cells, all these layers have to get their nutrition from the dermis that's deep to it, and then it's just going to diffuse up. So hopefully that you understand that if you're closer to the basement membrane, you're going to get like the full buffet. And then the further away you are, the less and less nutrition you're going to get, and those cells up there are going to be dying and dead. So let's talk first about what those 4 different cells are. The first one we're going to talk about is the keratinocyte, because it's more than 90% of the epithelial cells. And so if we look at the deepest layers of the epidermis, this is where we are going to find the keratinocytes undergoing mitosis. And then over time, they will work their way closer and closer to the surface. So on the picture, you would have mitotic figures down in here, and they get closer and closer to the surface of your skin. And that takes about 6 weeks, which is why, ladies, if you're buying a face cream and you use it for a week and you can't see any difference, it's because it takes it 6 weeks to see the difference. Now, they are anchored to each other with desmosomes to keep them from pulling apart, especially if you're rubbing your skin or doing anything like that, anything that requires friction, whether it's wearing a new pair of shoes. You don't want these to separate. So anchoring junctions, those desmosomes. So go back and review if you need to exactly the structure of that. And they're called keratinocytes, which technically means the cell of keratin, because they produce that protein known as keratin. So I think most of you have heard about keratin before. But in the skin, this is a protective keratin. It's also, you know, what makes our hair and our nails. But in the skin, it's going to be the protective coating of our skin. In addition, as the cells get further to the surface, they will start producing granules that become a water repellent sealant. We are not going to learn the names of those granules. I just I'm going to want you to realize, and I'll point out where this happens, that this is what is the sealant for water repellent so that we can take baths without absorbing all the bath water in our skin. The second cell type is called a melanocyte. And these are only going to be found in the deepest part of the epidermis, what's known as the stratum basale. And depending on your ethnic background, it could be 10% of these cells or it could be 25% of these cells. The reason why they're called melanocytes is because they are cells that make a pigment known as melanin. That's the pigment that you are getting more of when you get a suntan. And within the melanocytes, the melanin is in these little inclusions, which are all these red dots on this green melanocyte. And if you look at this melanocyte, what you'll notice is it has a lot of little extensions that go up between the other keratinocytes and more superficially. And so what happens when you're exposed to sunlight, this cell is going to make melanin and close it in these melanocytes, and then the melanin in this is going to be transferred to the keratinocyte. It's going to be transferred to dozens. Each melanocyte does dozens of the nearby keratinocytes. Okay. These inclusions are called melanosomes, but it's not really important to learn that term. So that's the first two cell types. The third cell type is called a Langerhans cell. And if you're taking further classes in nursing later on, you will, or immunology, you will learn that this is an example of a dendritic cell. But for us, we're just learning the word Langerhans cell. And for the Langerhans cell, I want you to envision it like a Roomba vacuum cleaner. And it's cruising around through all the middle layers of the epidermis, where all those cells that are alive are, and just kind of wanders around. Okay. And so this Langerhans cell actually came from the cells that are giving us some of our white blood cells. And so it performs an immune function. It becomes a macrophage, one of those cells that eats debris or other things. Later on, when you do immunology second semester, you'll learn what an APC cell is, but for now, you don't have to know that. So the MP there stands for, it's a macrophage. Okay. Now, interestingly, if you're getting one of those healthy suntans, that ultraviolet light is actually damaging and killing these dendritic cells, which then means they can't do their work, and you're much more likely to have foreign stuff be able to get through your epidermis into your dermis to make you sick. So these bottom two pictures are basically special stains so that you can see the Langerhans cells. The one on the left, I have like red arrows next to every one. And the one on the right, they're just black, which are very obvious to see. And so if you notice that the concentration is not the same, it's because the concentration does vary in different areas of your body. Now, the fourth and final cell is what's called a Merkel cell. And Merkel cells are only found in the deepest layer of the epidermis. And every Merkel cell is attached to a little sensory neuron, because this is the cell that's going to be a receptor for light touch. So when I come back and I talk about sensory receptors, I'll talk more about Merkel cells then. So now we're done with the 4 cell types, and we're going to talk about the 5 layers. And as we talk about 5 layers, we'll put those 4 cell types in the appropriate layers. So talking about the 5 layers, I am going to start at the deepest layer. So I'm going to start at the layer that's actually sitting on the basement membrane at the epidermal dermal junction. And that layer is called the stratum basale. So the basal layer is called the stratum basale. Okay. So cartoon drawing at the bottom, the stratum basale is this brownish layer. Here they all look like they're like little columnar-sized cells. In the picture photomicrograph above, that is all stratum basale. And what you know is like we have this little mitotic figure, we've got this other cell there. So here's where our precursors for our keratinocytes are going to be undergoing mitosis, and then they can move upward. Also, in addition to keratinocytes, we're going to have all of our melanocytes are here. So melanocytes are found in the stratum basale. Only found in the stratum basale. And thirdly, those Merkel cells, they're only found in the stratum basale as well. Okay. And if you recall, last week when I was talking about how epithelium is anchored to the basement membrane, I talked about the hemidesmosomes. Well, we're going to have the hemidesmosomes anchoring the SB, the stratum basale, to the BM, the basement membrane, here as well. All right. Moving superficial, so remember, stratum basale, deepest layer, only one cell thick. Moving superficial, our next layer is called the stratum spinosum. And the reason why it's called that is because on the light microscope, if you look at the upper picture, you can see like all these little spiny things connecting the cells, okay? So if you look at the cartoon drawing, what you should be able to notice now is the cells are more cuboidal-ish, okay? And this is more than one cell layer. In fact, this can be 10 cell layers. And here the keratinocytes are starting to produce the keratin. So that uppermost picture is basically just a zoom in where the little black box is on the bottom right picture. And what you were seeing, these little spiny connections between the cells, that's the zipper part of the desmosome, of the anchoring junction that you're actually seeing there. So that's what's holding these cells next to each other so they cannot pull apart. Also in some of these, you can see some scattered melanin. I'm not going to ask you to identify melanin on a photomicrograph, but I'll be showing you more cartoon drawings where you can clearly see the melanin. And in the stratum spinosum, in addition to all these keratinocytes, some which will have melanin and some which will not have melanin, this is where the Langerhans cells, the Roomba vacuum cleaners, are cruising around doing their work. All right. So now let's go to the middle, the third layer of the 5, and that's called the stratum granulosum. And the reason why it's called stratum granulosum is because when you look at it on the photomicrograph, it looks like it has all these little dots. It's very granular, and in fact, on the uppermost picture, you can clearly see the dark blue blob granules. Okay? So this is why in a photomicrograph, you can always find the stratum granulosum because it is going to be a dark layer that is superficial to the stratum spinosum. Okay? So this one's actually easier to see on a photomicrograph than it is on the cartoon drawing. So now looking at the cartoon drawing, you can see that the cells have flattened out, okay? They're looking squamous finally, and they're continuing to produce keratin. This is a transition layer. All the cells deep to it in the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum, they're alive doing their work. All the cells superficial to it, they're dead. So this is the layer where the cells are dying. They're doing their job, they're making keratin, they're also releasing the granules of waterproofing lipids, but they're also getting chemical messages telling them to undergo cell suicide, a process known as apoptosis, which is written there on that third word, apoptosis, one of those fun words for anatomy. Apoptosis, and the cell goes poof and dies. Okay. You may have some scattering of Langerhans cells present in this layer, but this layer is very thin, like 3 cell layers thick, whereas the stratum granulosum is bigger, so that's where you're going to be finding 90+% of the Langerhans cells. So just learn the Langerhans cells are in the stratum spinosum. Going superficial to the stratum granulosum, the next layer is known as the stratum lucedum because it's clear, you can see through it. So on a photomicrograph, it looks hazy, you don't see any cellular structure. And that's why on the models, it's often painted a white color. And so this is a layer that has very flat, very dead keratinocytes. There are no nuclei, there are no organelles. And this layer, what it's doing, it's reducing friction from the outermost layer, which we haven't named yet, and the stratum granulosum. Okay. In addition to that, it helps protect you from UV damage. So this is a layer that is an option. Okay. And where this layer occurs, that type of skin we call thick skin. If it's not present, we call it thin skin. So don't believe everything you find on Google, because in Google they're talking thick skin has a measurement of whatever and thin skin has a measurement of whatever, and it has nothing to do with that. Those are students who don't know what they are talking about. Thick skin is thick by definition because it's going to have 5 layers in the epidermis. And thin skin is thin by definition because it's not going to have this layer, so it's only going to have 4 layers in the epidermis. So then the question is, where do we have this? Palms of your hands and your fingertips. And then do the same on your feet. So the sole, the undersurface of your foot, and then all the little toe pads. Okay. So these are the areas that have the most friction, which is why we have this layer. And so it's cutting down the rubbing of everything that's dead, all the dead keratin above it from the live cells below. So you're much less likely to actually get blisters in this area than in other areas. However, since we do more friction in our hands, that is where we get most of our blisters, just because the amount of friction that we do there. But if you think about your feet, when you're having shoes rubbing, you're not likely to get a blister on the bottom of your foot, even though it's slip sliding in your shoe. You're going to get that blister on the back of your foot, where it's thin skin, because you don't have a stratum lucidum. So that brings me to the 5th and final layer, the most superficial layer. Oh, before I get there, so look at this picture. This is showing on the left, there is a very thin stratum lucidum, whereas on the right, there isn't. So on the left would be thick skin, because there are 5 layers. On the right would be thin skin, because there are 4 layers. All right. So now I'm ready for the superficial layer, which is the stratum corneum. And what this is layers of dead cells. Basically, it's keratin still in a sac. The outer plasma membrane hasn't broken down, but everything inside the cell is dead. So it's protective. This is what makes skin keratinized, as opposed to the mucosa being non-keratinized. And over your life, this stuff sheds, because if you scratch your arm, you can get all that little white stuff. If you have big clumps, that's when people are having dandruff. Those are big clumps of the stratum corneum. But you shed this all the time. In fact, you'll shed 40 pounds of this over your life. And if you realize that you spend about a third of your life in your bed, think about how old your mattress is. Oh no, think about how old your parents' mattress is. And there's been 2 of them sleeping in that bed for how many years? Yeah, if it feels like the bed is heavier now than it was 5 years ago, it's because it is. Okay. And for those of you who are getting henna tattoos, the henna tattoo is only going to the stratum corneum, which is why the henna tattoo disappears in a week to 10 days. If you want it to last longer, you want to buff your skin before to get rid of the more superficial layers of the stratum corneum, so it would go into the deeper layers. Okay, so this is what the surface of your skin looks like with a scanning electron microscope. It's not very sexy, is it? It's just these big bags, and inside which there's just a lot of keratin. So I have this picture up here, and I'd like you to pause this when I'm done talking. I'll tell you when to pause. And I want you to go through and try to label the either 4 or 5 layers, figure out if this is thick or thin skin. And then on the right, everything that has a black line is a specific type of cell. See if you can figure out which cell type it is. I will say the bottom 2 lines, which are both tagging the yellow structure, that's just the same yellow structure. And I'll just tell you that's the sensory neuron right there. Okay, so go ahead and pause it now. Answer the questions on your own. Write down your answers so you are committing yourself to them. Don't tell me. Don't just say it in your head, but physically commit yourself as if this was a quiz. And then when you turn it back on, I will bring up a slide with the answer. So go ahead and pause it now. Okay, so hopefully you did that exercise. And so now I'm going to show you the answers. And so go ahead and pause it now and check these answers versus the answers you did. All right, awesome. So moving on now, we're done with the cartoon drawing, and now I have 2 photomicrographs. And I want you to look at these 2, and I want you to decide for each one, is it thin skin or is it thick skin? So when I pause it, I want you to come back with your answer. They're both thick, or they're both thin, or there's one of each. So go ahead and pause it. Okay, so now that you're back, you know your answer. If you thought they were both thick skin, I'm sorry, you're mistaken. If you thought they were both thin skin, I'm sorry, you're also mistaken. So the correct answer is one is thin skin and one is thick skin. So think back for a second. How can we tell thin from thick? And I want you to pause it again. And now that you know one is thick and one is thin, figure out, is the thin one on this side or is the thin one on that side? So go ahead and pause it a second time while you're figuring out your answer. Okay, so hopefully you have your answer. You have figured out which one is thin and which one is thick. So here are your answers, and I have tagged them so that you clearly can see why one is thick and one is thin. And with that, we are done with epidermis. So that's the end of this one. And we will come back and talk about dermis and some stuff that's going on in there in the next lecture. So thank you for all your hard work, and I will see you soon.